So as I'm thinking about this issue and looking at presentations, the idea of, it was mentioned that one of the things that we have to do is become more resilient. And we look at ecological systems. A resilient system is one that has kind of dual qualities of having a lot of distributed parts, a lot of innovation, if you will, but also a lot of integration, a lot of connectivity within that system. And I'm thinking in terms of the governance aspect of it. Mr. Taylor, I heard you speak of, the U.S. could maybe make a difference by taking, you use the term unilateral action. And I see a common thread with Professor Adler suggesting that, that maybe we need to just encourage more innovation by deconstructing some of the centralized regulatory standards. So both seem to be arguing for more unilateral, less internationally cooperative approach. But I'm just wondering if you can speak to how that translates into more resilience globally when what we're also looking at is increasing desertification, increasing stresses resulting from the consequences of global climate change, and therefore, if you look at the history of environmental regulations, it's always taken a crisis to lead to collective action, and yet perhaps we can't afford that in the case of climate change given the scale of the problem. So what I'm asking maybe for either of you or both of you to speak to is, what does the multilateral dimension of your prescription look like if it's not from a regulatory standpoint? Well, how do you envision the nations cooperating in a framework that also allows for the kind of innovation and kind of unilateral initiative that we're advocating for? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton there. So, start with where the question began in terms of ecological systems. Ecological systems are certainly dynamic adaptive systems. A market economy is a dynamic adaptive system. Centralized structures tend not to be. And that means if what we rely upon is wait until there's a crisis, get a centralized response, we may fix the problem in the short term, but we're not actually creating a system that enables us to continue to respond as our information base changes, as our understanding changes, as various parts respond to one another. This is easier to think about on the adaptation side and resiliency side than it is on the mitigation side. But if you look at some of the work that's been done in that area, and I've written a few papers in this area as well, although others have certainly done far more, you actually find an amazing amount of confluence of what people recommend. So the area that I'm most familiar with is water. We know that if you're worried about the way water works in an environmental system, that building really big dams and kind of centralized structures and institutions are designed to just make sure a certain amount of water is in a certain place at a certain time is ecologically disruptive, would be a nice way to put it. But if you have any real understanding of the nature of changes in water cycles over time, it's also a bit futile. We know that water systems have not been anywhere near as static as we believed they were. This is true in our floodplain models. This is true in our storm models. This is true in our precipitation models, and so on. And climate change, by adding a lot more energy to the system, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, makes that rate of change, the potential degree of change, even larger. So we had a bad fit before, and climate change makes it even worse. What kind of the market economist folks would say, well, you need a way of dealing with water that's not centralized command and control. It's not building big dams and things like that, but it's more market-oriented. Turns out, if you go to the IPCC reports, and the reports that talk about what do we do when climate change occurs, and you see these pans to water markets, and the use of water rights as a way of creating dynamic adaptive systems that allows water to be reallocated where it's used. And then you go to places like Oregon and talk to my friends at the Oregon Water Trust, who are working on the ground to try and ensure there are in-stream flows for salmon and other fish species. And what do they tell you? They say they need the ability to participate in these dynamic market systems. And so on the adaptation side, we actually know that there should be a lot of a consensus. And there are a handful of environmental areas where across ideological divisions, you see these sorts of recognitions. Fisheries would be another example. When it comes to mitigation, it's a little harder because we are dealing with regulatory structures that are in place. We're dealing with incumbent firms that have tremendous interests in the status quo. Jerry mentioned the coal industry that believes that somehow the Trump administration can delay the day of reckoning for the coal industry that has been brought about by a lot of exogenous factors, cheap natural gas, the increasing competitiveness of renewables in many applications, and so on. So you have the dynamic there is a little different. But I think one of the reasons why both Jerry and I like the carbon tax is, certainly for me, I don't have a lot of confidence in very smart, well-intended people of figuring out how we should be using energy 10 years from now, let alone 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I have more confidence, not perfect confidence, but more confidence that if we can create more incentives for people to think more carefully about what energy they're using and where they're using it and how they're using it, that in a dynamic adaptive marketplace, we will see more movement in that direction. And so I think that thinking about it that way certainly informs my thinking in terms of saying, okay, we know the type of innovation we want. We know the general direction we want. We don't know how to mandate it, but we know how to do a lot more than what we're doing to accelerate it and incentivize it. And while that doesn't guarantee us a solution, I think it increases the odds that we're going to get something on the timescales we want because we're taking advantage of the broader system and the incentives that we can put in that system, rather than thinking that, well, if we just give the right grant to my friends in the engineering department, who I should say are doing some really cool stuff, right? They actually have some electricity storage stuff that optimistically is about 2 years from market, which could be really important for some of these problems. But putting all our eggs in those sorts of baskets, I think, it doesn't take advantage of where we see innovation and change.
I agree with Jonathan. I'd add 2 points. First of all, unilateral U.S. action is not an end unto itself. The idea is to encourage other nations to do likewise through trade policy. So if you want access to the U.S. market, your products will be taxed at the border to reflect their carbon content. That is a tremendous incentive for other nations to entertain a carbon tax if they want access to the U.S. market. That allows them, as I mentioned, to keep the revenue that otherwise would go to the United States Treasury. Other economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Bill Nordhaus have argued for a carbon tax club, where the United States and whatever partners of the willing might be would agree on a certain carbon price, and trade within those, between those countries are not affected, but trade with actors outside of those countries are taxed as they enter in. That's the sort of thing that could allow for unilateral action to be paired with international conversation. But one thing I want to make clear, as much as I have no, so far, as Jonathan's mentioned, as I've argued, international negotiations have accomplished precious little over the course of nearly 3 decades. So we should not be too excited about prospects for that sort of changing. But the reality is that it is immoral, in my opinion, for the United States to continue to put the planet in harm and to put the future generations at risk just because some other nations are willing to do it. I mean, seriously, this is, in my opinion, a fundamentally moral argument. It's as if there was a group of people looting a store, and then I decide, I'm going to stop looting the store, I'm going to walk away. And then somebody says, well, the store's still going to get looted. That's crazy. All these other people are just going to make a lot. You're not helping the store any, really. Okay, maybe a few fire bombs you might have thrown in there, The place is still going to get trashed. No, but it's immoral to be involved in looting the store. And it's the same way in climate change. It is immoral to put the planet at this kind of risk, to put the future generation at this kind of risk. And it is also, from my old libertarian playbook, immoral for Party A to destroy the property of Party B simply because A made a heck of a lot of money doing so and profited more than B lost, which is an argument I stole from Jonathan Adler many years ago.
Still good argument.
So I
I have a question. We were talking about the carbon tax and status quo. And so if we were to change the status quo and go towards a carbon tax, that would mean many companies losing billions of dollars, like Shell, ExxonMobil. And so my question is, how can we expect Congress to change if they in fact they receive thousands and thousands of dollars of donations from these companies, and while they might say it doesn't influence their decisions, it's going to be difficult for them to push for a carbon tax if, I don't know, ExxonMobil donates 10 grand to their campaign. So my question is, if we expect real change, how can we do that unless campaigns are publicly funded?
Well, let me take point on this one, since what I do at Niskanen, for the most part, besides coming out here giving talks, trying to raise money for my organization, is we work on Capitol Hill relentlessly. We are not in the business of waging and winning the war of ideas in Dubuque, Iowa. Nothing wrong with Dubuque, and there's nothing wrong with the people of Dubuque, and those are worthy things to do, but we focus on Washington. That's, in our opinion, the key to policy change. So let's talk about those Republicans. First of all, let's talk about the oil companies. Virtually all the majors have come out in favor of a carbon tax. Virtually every last one of them. ExxonMobil has, Royal Dutch Shell has, BP has. Now, if you page the environmental community, they say, it's greenwashing, they don't really mean it. Notice they're not putting any energy into lobbying for it. They just kind of throw it up there on their website. If you ask them what would your plan look like, they don't have one. It's just kind of a bunch of hot. And there may be there's truth to the observation that they're not investing time and energy lobbying for it, but the main reason is they don't think that right now the political opportunities are very good for it. And like any other dollar, you can spend it lobbying for this, or this. So you're not going to waste your resources as a lobbyist trying to tell Donald Trump he's wrong, he should put the knife to the coal industry and have a carbon tax. Probably not your best bet. But the reason I think that it's a meaningful position that they take, that it's not just empty talk, is that internally, most of these oil companies likewise have a shadow carbon price they apply on all future investments. So if they're thinking about drilling here or there or elsewhere, they are looking at what they think production costs are going to be, plus a price on carbon. Some of them have it at $40, $50, $60. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they want it, but they're assuming it'll be there sooner or later. And so these are long-term investments. They would need to be competitive and economic even under a carbon price. So when you talk to the oil industry, they support a carbon price because, one, they have come to believe that climate change is a real thing, that it's not made up. And even the papers that have been leaked out of Exxon tell that story internally going back 30 years. And second, if the government doesn't act, they are vulnerable to lawsuits. Damages, just like in the smoking situation. And they don't want that story either. And third, if the government doesn't act, environmentalists wage a Vietnam-style guerrilla war against all oil and gas infrastructure like Keystone Pipeline. They're going to win some, they're going to lose some, they're probably going to lose more than they're going to win. And they just rather settle this aside. And if the government's going to act, they would rather let the marketplace decide, let ExxonMobil and BP decide when, where, and how to produce energy rather than have that decision made at the Department of Energy or EPA. Now, all of that having been said, not all oil and gas companies agree. Koch Industries, now they're not as big as Exxon, but they are way more influential in the Republican Party than is Exxon. And small oil and gas is rabidly opposed to climate action because they're nowhere near as profitable at the margin, and a carbon tax could conceivably kill them out. So it won't kill out BP or ExxonMobil. They'll be fine. You talk to their execs like, yeah, we'll be fine. We'll be good. Little guys could go down. So is that a problem that prohibits, because of Charles Koch, say, or small oil and gas, or coal? Does that mean it's impossible to imagine action? No, only a decade ago, less than a decade ago, this same Republican Party, which is planted its flag firmly, in my opinion, in know-nothing denials, just a decade ago, nominated for president a man who was talking about climate change as if he was Al Gore, and who promised a federal cap-and-trade program that would have been more ambitious than what was rejected by the United States Senate in 2010. Right? That is John McCain. Did oil, gas, coal, and the Kochs keep John McCain from becoming the nominee of the Republican Party? No. They tried, they lost. The 2008 Republican Party platform could have been written by Senator Shell of the White House, the most aggressive proponent of climate action in the United States Senate today. The Republican Party platform of 2008 was an extremely ambitious document calling for get rid of fossil fuels, using markets to do it. Now, the reason why the party shifted, there's a big story about why that was. It wasn't because oil, gas, and coal was asleep in 2008, just woke the hell up in 2009 and said, what are we doing here? No. What happened was the Tea Party came on the scene. Charles Koch came on the scene in a very significant way, in a fashion that he was not in 2008, but boy, he was in 2009, 2010, and has stayed there thereafter. And I don't believe that that is the only reason for a lack of climate action. But it's a really important one, because Charles Koch and his power within the GOP in Washington is pretty much off the charts. So I don't think in the long run it means that we can't necessarily envision a scenario of victory. Because while that's true, there are a lot of Republicans who are deeply uncomfortable with climate orthodoxy in the GOP. Probably 40 to 60 members in the House and about a dozen members in the Senate. Now they don't know what the plan ought to look like. They're not all on carbon taxes yet. They're not in agreement about how much ambition. But they know that climate change is a real problem. They want the federal government to respond, and they want the GOP to lead the way. Now, what that looks like is what I do for a living. But if you had only half of them defect out and kind of like to make a breakout from this penitentiary they're locked into by the Trumpists and the Kochs and the other gendarmes of the hard right, and the Democrats were united, that's the margin. You pass things.
I agree with some of that, I disagree with some of that, but let me, so in the first years of the Obama administration, Congress considered a bill to, among other things, do cap and trade for carbon emissions. It also would have done a lot more. It was an incredible regulatory expansion, so much so that even the Washington Post raised concerns about some of the sorts of regulation that it would lead to. It barely squeaked by the House and was dead on arrival in the Senate. And one of my colleagues actually thought that the reason why it was so close in the House and the reason why it died in the Senate was because of lobbying by various fossil fuel and other interests against the bill. So he actually went and published a peer-reviewed paper looking at all the lobbying records and looking at who reported lobbying on climate change and then whether they were lobbying for Waxman-Markey, against Waxman-Markey, or on Waxman-Markey, which usually means if this is going to pass, just make sure my little gift is here. And it turns out that lobbying expenditures, it wasn't swamped by industry lobbying expenditures against the bill. That the lobbying expenditures were pretty evenly matched. So in terms of what actually happened, it can't be explained by industry discount. I think that understanding political ideology, particularly the grassroots, is necessary. I wouldn't make Charles Koch essential to the story, but I do think that is a huge part of it. And one of the reasons when you look at the Waxman-Markey bill, right, cap and trade is supposed to be this market-oriented, not very heavy-handed regulatory approach. But if that's what the House had really wanted to do, we would have had a very short bill that would have been about the length of the acid rain provisions of the 1990 Clean Air Act. It would have been very little beyond that. And instead, you had hundreds of pages, not only of additional regulatory mandates, but on top of that, of provisions detailing how some of the emissions credits were going to be allocated. In the view of its opponents, was this: you're giving us a price on carbon that we're going to pay with R&D prices. You're giving us regulations on top of that, and on top of that, you're giving us all this corporate welfare because after allocating carbon emissions, you're then going to give it out to your buddies. And that was actually the political theory behind how that bill could pass. The proponents in the House's view was, we're going to impose this cap and trade system, and then we're going to give out enough goodies to get it across the line. And that was based on the assumption that that passage was a function of economic interest at stake. And what people underestimated was, to a lot of people, especially in the grassroots of the Republican Party, combining a regulatory expansion and increased energy prices with corporate welfare made the bill doubly bad. Right? So for the emerging Tea Party, trying to soften the imposition of this bill by allocating credits to certain energy companies made the bill worse. Remember, Tea Party's first big political victories were about things like getting rid of earmarking on appropriations bills. And so larding up this environmental measure with these special energy provisions made it farther away from something that could have been expected. could have been embraced. And so I think that's a part of the, and in that respect was very different from the sort of things McCain had been calling for. Going forward, what I think is going to be important is what sort of deal can be made over something like a carbon tax. And again, I don't think the big players are going to be the Exxons and the BP. I think the independent energy producers are important, particularly the more that oil, their businesses in oil as opposed to natural gas, because of the relative carbon component. The coal industry is going to continue to care about this insofar as there is a coal industry. Had there been a Democratic president elected in the last election, the deal that we might have envisioned would have been trading a carbon tax for things like the Clean Power Plan and regulatory authority over greenhouse gases. And the reason why that might be appealing to some folks on the right is that for the same reasons British Columbia could implement a carbon tax in a matter of months when it took EPA years and years to implement the Acid Rain program, replacing EPA regulation of greenhouse gases with a national carbon tax would actually result in a reduction in government intrusion in the economy. A reduction in the number of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. administering the program. So for people for whom, which is a large part of the Republican base, for whom the primary issue is the extent of Washington, D.C.'s tentacles throughout the country, that trade is actually a net gain purely just in terms of governmental intervention. And Jerry may disagree with the Clean Power Plan there, but that we could have seen the outlook of that sort of deal, and if you make the carbon tax revenue neutral, rebating it the way British Columbia does or something like that, I think then you can also make the pitch that you're not increasing the overall tax burden. You're paying what taxes are imposed on, but the aggregate burden is staying relatively constant. And folks like Jim Hansen and some other folks who proposed similar sorts of proposals. So how might that happen? Trump administration right now is trying to rescind the Clean Power Plan and some other regulations that relate to greenhouse gases. Looking at the proposals they've put forward, I don't think they're going to succeed. That's not because I don't think it's possible. It's because I just don't think they're actually working the administrative process the way it needs to be worked to actually succeed in that sort of regulatory change. It's like trying to change course for a tanker, or some big ship. Then it takes a lot of effort, all hands on deck, to dramatically change regulatory policy through the administrative process. The executive orders don't matter. What matters is, can the EPA go through a notice and comment rulemaking, dotting every I, crossing every T, addressing every counter argument, dealing with every legal and other issue that's raised by changing policy, and that takes a lot of work. It takes having agencies fully staffed with political appointees that know what they're doing, and it takes a career staff that's willing to cooperate, and the Trump administration has none of those things right now. They haven't nominated people, they haven't appointed people, the people they have nominated in the relevant agencies aren't confirmed, and the career staff is not overly enthusiastic to work long nights trying to help them undo their regulatory measures. So I suspect they're going to fail. And there was a New York Times story about 2 months ago, a month ago, pointing out they've already faced a bunch of court setbacks on regulatory matters. And so the possible scenario, I think, is Clean Power Plan repeal gets thrown out of court. Some of these other regulatory measures get thrown out of court. Scott Pruitt's gone off and runs for Senate or governor or whatever in Oklahoma. There's a new EPA administrator. And the goal is, well, what do we do now? We have the same regulations that were in place under the Obama administration, and is there something we can do about that? And so maybe at that point in time, there's a window to have this sort of deal where you trade what I would argue are fairly intrusive and not particularly dynamic and helpful regulatory measures for a carbon tax that actually can help align the incentives we want, and maybe we see something like that. And if we see something like that, the big oil companies like Jerry mentioned, they'll be on board with that kind of thing. They'll be happy with that kind of thing. Give them a price, tell them the rate at which that price changes. They're good to go. They know how to model that. They know how to deal with that in terms of their internal structures. So a lot of those folks would be on board. They're not going to invest in that deal now, but if there's someone that puts it on the table, I agree with Jerry that they'd be happy to sign up for that.
Just to put a footnote to that, the deal that Jonathan's just discussed was the table was set for that deal had Hillary won in November. The Clinton campaign was silent on a carbon tax because they didn't want to contaminate it in the GOP and render it radioactive. But I know senior people in that campaign who are working with Hillary on this. She was all set for a carbon tax deal with the Republicans who were going to put the idea in play in the early days of this Congress. Simply because even people like James Inhofe, who is a very aggressive climate skeptic in the Senate, says, look, if we're going to be doing this, I'd far rather do it with market prices in a market-friendly fashion than through regulations. And Inhofe, when pressed, said, I would not rule out a carbon tax if there was a regulatory swap involved. The question is what kind of swap we're looking at. So if even James Inhofe can entertain that conversation, it means that there are terms and conditions upon which the deal can be done in a window of opportunity.
And the deal would basically be, and I think, I'm curious if you agree with this, what I think would be is that say the EPA would get out of the business of stationary source regulation, so regulation of power plants and things like that for greenhouse gas purposes. They continue to have their regulatory authority for traditional pollutants. Industries like automobiles, where the existing rules are already in place, they've already been designing new product models based on those regs. That's what would be untouched, and the stuff that is yet to be imposed is what would have been traded, and wouldn't have been a bad deal.
Okay, we have time for one more, so go for it.
So along with the proposed carbon tax, would another beneficial solution to solving, well, not solving, but at least mitigating the effects of global climate change on both a local and national level be providing incentives for positive actions such as restoring habitats that act as carbon sinks by paying companies to restore, protect, and expand such habitats?
In theory, yes. In practice, color me skeptical. And the reason is that we have a little bit of experience with this in trading regimes maintained by Europe. They did go forward with Kyoto, though the United States did not, so there's a trading regime there. And if you go do a little homework, get on Google, type in carbon sinks and climate and cap and trade and whoosh, because it is an industry riddled by fraud. Absolutely. I tell 4 different people I would have developed had it not been for their pain. Right? Or I manifest an interest in development which is utterly bogus, so you pay me not to do it. Or I develop anyway, catch me if you can. Or I'll develop 2 years from now, though I took your payment today, you're just moving me temporarily 2 years down the line. So the hell what? Do you go back then and now lose the credit? These are fiendishly difficult things to track, difficult things to police. And for that reason, while in theory, sure, I mean, providing for more robust carbon sinks through protection of forestry and forested areas and all that, and maybe expanding ag. I mean, yeah, absolutely. But oh my God, trying to manage that in a policy sense has at least up to this point proven devilishly tricky.
I agree with that. It is hard, and you see this in terms of tax treatment of conservation easements and the like. Enforcement is a real concern. In the case of the EU trading scheme, the concern was that Russia had all of this, all these carbon credits to sell, and it appears that some were sold again and again, and very hard to enforce. There are certainly things that can be done at the local level that would be helpful. There is a question about whether or not, politically or otherwise, the federal government is very good at incentivizing and encouraging that, and whether politically, when you start talking about policies in Washington that are going to encourage local zoning commissions to do one thing or the other, politically that's very, very sensitive. I mean, the concerns of a federal takeover and so. But the reality is, if we could make it easier for developers to not use black tar on rooftops, even to go further and actually have rooftops where you have gardens and the like on roof. I mean, there's all sorts of things like that which would help potentially with carbon, but also just from the Hiram effect. As I say, that the climate change effects can be magnified in dense urban areas because of urban heat islands, and that has all sorts of effects on, has effects on smog formation, has other potential health effects. There are other reasons why we don't want our urban areas to be as sensitive to, or as good at capturing heat as they are. And so there's lots of room there to do good things. It's just using the federal government to incentivize that is tricky. But certainly something that's worth doing. And you know, best practices for urban development and you know, programs like LEED and the like aren't perfect, but they are slowly encouraging developers and land use folks to be more aware of these sorts of things, and we are getting some change there, and that will certainly be helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you'll join me in thanking our two guests for coming. I think that was really interesting. Thank you both. And I'm looking forward to more of it after dinner. For those of you who aren't coming to dinner, it's a pleasure to see you. And for those of you who are coming to dinner, we're heading over to Kortansky Hall for cocktails, food, and further intellectual stimulation. So we'll see you there. Thank you.